Recently, thanks to the Netflix series and Duskman Damon's encouragement over the years, I decided to read through all the Witcher books. I had a vague notion of what to expect, but I didn't know too much about the series, except what I could glean from the occasional Witcher 3 clip that popped up in my YouTube recommendations. I read The Last Wish, quite liked it, and then was thoroughly hooked after Sword of Destiny. However, when I began to read the full-length novels, as opposed to the short story collections, things began to change. Blood of Elves was a complete waste of time, with no plot to speak of, but I thought, okay, maybe this is just to get people who haven't read the short stories up to speed, and I persevered. Time of Contempt had a somewhat drawn-out conclusion, but was okay enough. But then, Baptism of Fire felt like only half a book, and after The Tower of Swallows, I was so disillusioned with the series that I gave up only a quarter of the way through Lady of the Lake. If I were to give each of the books a number ranking like I would with my fantastic fiction series, I'd give The Last Wish a 7 out of 10, Sword of Destiny a 9 out of 10, Blood of Elves a 3 out of 10, Time of Contempt a 7 out of 10, Baptism of Fire a 5 out of 10, Tower of Swallows a 5 out of 10, and Lady of the Lake a 1 out of 10. You can see, even with the slight second wind of Time of Contempt, there's a distinct decline in my enjoyment of the series after they shift from short stories and into novels. So, it all rather begs the question, what happened? And how did the short stories I love so much give way to the novels I gave up on? Before we address that question, I should make something clear. If you are a fan of the Witcher Saga novels, then I have no problem with that whatsoever. I'm not in the business of telling people what they should or shouldn't like, merely telling people what to expect from a piece of media. Tropes or story elements that don't appeal to me may still appeal to you, and indeed, Duskman Damon is a massive fan of the Witcher novels. So, I'm less interested in hating on the Witcher books than I am in examining why exactly the short stories appealed to me so much when the novels simply didn't. That way, if you too are interested in reading the Witcher series in the wake of the show's second season coming out on Netflix, this video might help you decide whether you want to read all the books or just the short stories. So, without further ado, let's address the biggest difference between the short stories and novels, and the biggest issue that I had with the series as a whole. Structure and style. Stories rely on narrative build-up and payoff. The characters all have something that they want, their quest to obtain this something moves the plot forward, and after we get invested in this quest, how the characters achieve or don't achieve their attainment is the satisfying payoff to our emotional investment. A simple example. Little Red Riding Hood wants to give some confectionery treats to her ailing grandmother. She goes to her granny's cottage and faces off against a wolf in her quest to fulfill this desire, and after the wolf has been killed and the day saved, Little Red Riding Hood gets to give her granny the confectionery treats, thus achieving her goals and satisfying our emotional investment in her quest. A more epic example. Odysseus wants to get back home after surviving the Trojan War. He gets tossed around the whole Mediterranean Sea on a series of perilous escapades until his whole crew has perished and a full decade has passed. The stakes of the Odyssey are higher than that of Little Red Riding Hood, and the text is longer, but the basic structure of build-up and payoff remains. The protagonists want something, they go after it, and after some conflict, they get it. The Witcher short stories operate under a similar structure. Geralt of Rivia is a Witcher, a superpowered being who hunts monsters for a living, and each short story finds him dealing with some famous fairy tale or fantasy cliché, but with a dark twist. This is entirely intentional. The fairy tales are incredibly popular in Poland. I mean, they're popular everywhere, but they're especially popular in Poland, on the same level as King Arthur is in England or Charlemagne is in France. Indeed, King Krakus, Poland's legendary king and culture hero, is said to have started out as a poor cobbler before he slayed a mighty dragon, just like in a fairy tale. To quote Sapkowski's opinion on that fairy tale, though, "It is a lie," says Sapkowski. Poor cobblers make good shoes. They don't kill monsters. The soldiers and knights, they are idiots generally. And priests only want the money and f***ing adolescents. So who's killing monsters? Professionals. You don't call poor cobblers apprentices, you call for professionals. So then, I invented the professional. And Geralt is exactly that. Not only slaying dragons, but encountering darker variants of Snow White, Beauty and the Beast, The Little Mermaid, and other famous fairy tales. The joy of the short stories is in watching how the presence of a fantasy Batman derails or deranges the stories and tropes we all know and possibly love. Essentially, through the Witcher short stories, Sapkowski does with sex and violence what Terry Pratchett does with humor, deconstructing cliches and subverting expectations. However, after the short stories turned Sapkowski into a household name, he decided to take on a new challenge. As in many places, the fantasy genre is popular in Poland, with many famous authors being translated and finding an audience there. But could a Polish author make a fantasy epic that could compete not simply in their own country, but the international market? This was the 90s, when epic fantasy was seriously kicking off with authors like Robert Jordan, Terry Goodkind, and George R.R. Martin. And this is also the point where the fundamental purpose of Sapkowski's writing changed. Rather than deconstruction or subversion, Sapkowski was now trying to write an epic fantasy saga with the same underlying tropes and conventions as his English-speaking counterparts. I should make clear at this point that I have never actually read anything by Robert Jordan, Terry Goodkind, or George R.R. Martin, so I don't know how well the Witcher novels succeed in that regard. But I do know that one of the most notable aspects of this genre is its massive length. It's not called epic fantasy for nothing, and this is why I brought up Little Red Riding Hood and the Odyssey earlier. To give you an idea of what Sapkowski was attempting with his transition to novels, I want you to imagine the characters and world of Red Riding Hood stretched out in length and explored to the same depth as the Mediterranean Sea Odysseus journeys across. It's not impossible, but it is somewhat incongruous, and this is the biggest, most fundamental issue I have with the Witcher novels. Every Witcher short story has a self-contained narrative arc, its own build-up and payoff. Even if they're all connected by being in the same world and having one story sometimes reference the events of another, each short story has its own beginning, middle, and end. In contrast, the novels are less 5 separate books and more one big book split up into 5 parts. And this is something that personally grinds my gears to no end. Especially when the books fall prey to slog. Yes, slog. This is a term I first heard from Robert Jordan fans, used to describe moments in the Wheel of Time series where, to fill out the page count, Jordan would write filler. Excessive descriptions, drawn-out dialogue, unnecessary subplots, anything to fatten up the spine of his book. Now, as any Wheel of Time fan like Daniel Green will tell you, they're willing to put up with the slog because the nuggets of gold outweigh the fat you have to wade through. However, if you, like me, are someone with a low tolerance for slog, I can tell you right now that the Witcher novels will frustrate you to no end. While the Witcher novels are not nearly as long as something like the Wheel of Time, they are of a sizable length. And yet, despite this length, not much actually happens in them. The basic story formula, where Geralt is just minding his own business before some antagonistic power forces him to get involved in a fetch quest or monster slaying, that remains unchanged from the short stories. It's just that now the story beats are stretched out as long as Sapkowski can manage it. So how does Sapkowski manage it? Well, mostly by introducing a bunch of side characters and subplots that don't go anywhere or add anything to the main plot. Geralt already had a stable supporting cast in these short stories, with Yennefer, a sorceress and his on-again off-again girlfriend, Dandelion, a spoony bard and his plucky sidekick, and Ciri, a princess with some unspecified magical destiny and his apprentice and ward. And once the short stories transitioned to novels, I was eager to see how Sapkowski would further explore these characters and their relationships. But
guess what, motherfucker?
None of that shit ever happens! Oh, you like this team? Well, you're never gonna see them all together for the rest of the series! I mean, maybe you do in the last part of the last book, but even if that's the case, you still have to spend 4 whole books where the team is split up and sidelined in favor of a bunch of new characters we don't care about. Dandelion does nothing. If you cut him out of the novels, it wouldn't change anything. Yennefer kind of does stuff, and I did like her personal subplot where she confronts her past, but she barely appears over the course of the story. And Ciri... we'll get to her later. Instead of the team that you already know and care about, Sapkowski makes up a whole new team for Geralt. There's Milva the Archer, Cahir the Emo Boy, Regis the Vampire, and Angoulême the... Anyways, the thing you gotta understand about these people is that, with the exception of Regis, I actually had to look up their names for this video. Sapkowski introduces all these new characters to make the plot more epic, but then he doesn't really know what to do with them afterwards. Milva is introduced as this cool, badass archer, and she gets to do cool, badass archery stuff, but as a character, she just kind of mopes? Cahir similarly has a skill set that moves the plot along, but as a character, he's a stereotypical emo boy. Regis is a vampire, and Angoulême... The new team that Geralt gets is emblematic of a larger problem with the series. Do you think that this powerful, badass wizard Vilgefortz is going to be the Darth Vader to Emperor Emirvar Emrys? Well, too bad, because he does nothing but sulk and scheme for the rest of the series. What complex and intricate plan do the largest sorceresses have in store? Oh, they're just gonna, go into a king's dreams and ask him to do something for them. But, I mean, given how we had to sit through a whole fucking book of it with Blood of Elves, surely series Witcher training will count for something, right? Oh, you poor, misguided fools! These issues of drawn-out build-up with little payoff are bad enough on their own, but compounding it all is the fact that Sapkowski is now no longer working with short stories, but a massive saga split up over 5 books, and serialization breeds suspense. If you pose a question or cliffhanger and then make people wait for the resolution, no matter how long they have to wait, they are going to now have more investment in this build-up, and more disappointment if it doesn't pay off. I read the books back to back, and when one of these subplots and characters was set up in one book, I kept reading because I wanted to see it get resolved in the next one. However, resolution would either be pushed back for an even later book, or so simple and basic that I felt cheated once it arrived. I honestly cannot imagine having to wait a whole year between each installment, but I have a feeling that it would have only made my disappointment worse, and the plot's overextension even more glaring. But that's just the plot. What about the themes? Sapkowski at least continues his deconstruction of fairy tales, right? Well... Grimdark. The Witcher short stories are pretty light on a theme. This isn't to say that they don't have themes, just that, like a lot of short stories, due to their length, they're more content to pose questions without providing answers. Their main draw is ultimately deconstruction and subversion, and yet Geralt typically has to grapple with some moral dilemma in each story. And the monsters he hunts usually turn out to be much less monstrous than they first appear. So, the short stories are surprisingly deep, even if that depth is largely left up to the reader's own imagination or conclusions. However, while short stories are more suited for having the reader fill in narrative or thematic gaps, novels are long enough that readers expect something more. Not simply showing a confrontation, but all the steps that led up to it. Not simply posing a question, but providing an answer. And not simply deconstructing and subverting, but actually making something of its own. This would prove to be a challenge for The Witcher, because while the short stories were expressly designed around mocking and destroying fairy tales and fantasy clichés, the novels were expected to imitate and emulate popular fantasy trends of the time. It was very much a square peg in a round hole situation, and what do you do when you want to fit a square peg into a round hole? You bring out the hammer and you double down. In this case, the doubling down came in the form of Sapkowski picking an element that was quite common throughout the 90s and which most closely resembled the deconstruction of his short stories, and then injecting copious amounts of it into the Witcher novels. That element being 90s edginess. This is a pretty common trend in a lot of 90s media, partially due to the economic and political malaise of the decade, and partially due to the desire for stereotypically nerdy genres in media to prove their maturity. Sex, violence, and grim nihilism were the name of the game for comics, movies, and fantasy novels from this time period. What Lindsay Ellis calls
hot fantasy that fucks.
The thing is, with regards to fantasy, this edginess arose largely from a desire to challenge the idealized medievalism of authors like J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. However, nowadays it's become a cliché in its own right, and something of a bad joke among many fantasy fans. While writing the Witcher novels, though, Sapkowski was not in on the joke, and so the novels feature copious amounts of gruesome, gritty violence and people being horrible, sadistic, and petty, even if it doesn't really serve any narrative purpose. Just about everyone Geralt encounters over the course of the novels is a complete and utter bastard. The local kings are power-hungry backstabbers, the Nilfgaard Empire is an oppressive totalitarian regime, the freedom fighters are a bunch of easily manipulated rubes, the elves regard everyone else as a slave race fit only to lick their boots, the peasants are a horde of ignorant, violent thugs. Oh, and to top it all off, there's an oncoming ice age that's going to kill everyone sooner or later, so any outcome to the events of the novels is utterly pointless. Here's the thing. The Witcher novels are trying to construct a fantasy epic, but they're doing so with a world and characters that were explicitly designed to destroy. The short stories have a teenage rebelliousness about them as they deconstruct and subvert fairy tales and fantasy cliches, and I had fun reading them because they're compact and full of action and forward motion. When the novels slow the plot down to a crawl and fill the pages with characters having long-winded conversations, though, it becomes abundantly clear that Sapkowski doesn't really have any alternative to replace the ideas and themes he mocks and destroys with The Witcher. Simply mocking and destroying old romanticism is enough, with those who have learned the truth of the world being superior and clever, and those who still cling to hope and happiness being schmucks who need to have their idealism beaten out of them. It's with the novels that The Witcher stops being cynical towards happily ever afters and Prince Charmings, and becomes actively hostile to the ideas of heroism or positive outcomes. And it is this exact sort of juvenile nihilism that an immature person mistakes for maturity. The kind of mindset that is necessary for you to let go of childhood fantasies, but which you have to outgrow to properly become an adult. And honestly, I'm just not into that kind of stuff anymore. I am no longer the sullen teenager who read his first Christopher Hitchens. And I simply cannot get into a piece of media that wallows in its own smug pessimism anymore. However, there is one other major thematic aspect of the Witcher novels which I have to bring up sooner or later. Thus far, I've danced around the issue, but now I have to address the elephant in the room. That elephant being women. Okay. It is impossible to talk about The Witcher without talking about rape and sexual violence. For the purposes of this video, I have cordoned all talk of that sort of thing to this particular section, so if your reaction to the subject is a strict no thank you, skip here to this timestamp. I should warn you though, rape is such a common part of The Witcher that if you prefer your fantasy free of sexual violence, it's probably best to just avoid the whole Witcher series. I wasn't kidding about the 90s itchiness. Okay, so for those of you who are still with us, before I read any Witcher stories, one of the few sources of information I had on Andrzej Sapkowski was his Wikipedia page, which has a quote of his that goes like this. I believe that the feminine element dominates in nature. Women are generally stronger than men. All power of this world should be in the hands of women. Life, the world, are too serious to leave it in our hands. I've confirmed from friends that this is indeed an accurate translation of what he said in the original Polish source, and when I read it, it left me with a distinct impression that Sapkowski was going to have a more positive portrayal of female authority than is standard for the genre. So, when the sorceresses showed up, my first assumption was, oh, hey, this must be that ideal matriarchy Sapkowski was talking about. Except, the sorceresses don't really do anything except cat and bitch and fuck. Like, when they're in conversation, the conversation is almost always about watching their figures, or how that one sorceress is such a bitch, or, oh damn, that Geralt boy is fine, I'ma ride him like a stolen bike. And that's another thing. Just about every woman in The Witcher desperately wants to fuck Geralt, because he is not like other men. Trademark. The only 2 women in the entire series I know who don't want to fuck Geralt are the priestess Nenica and Ciri. And Ciri at least gets really territorial around Yennefer when she first meets her, grilling her on her exact relationship with Geralt. Now, admittedly, if you are Henry Cavill, I don't necessarily blame women for getting all hot and bothered in your presence, but the idea of 99% of all women immediately spreading like peanut butter in Geralt's presence, it gets increasingly tiresome after it keeps happening for so long, especially when it's part of the slog that only serves to lengthen the page count. Not helping matters is Sapkowski's extreme willingness to resort to rape when it comes to his female characters' backstories. Milva was threatened with rape as a child, and Golem was gang-raped before meeting Geralt. Triss the Sorceress raped Geralt for a change of pace, although of course the narrative doesn't treat it as rape, and Ciri gets raped so many times over the course of the series. In the short stories and Blood of Elves, Ciri is set up as the Child of Destiny, the Lion Cub of Sintra, the Chosen One, who will do great things and fulfill some important unspecified destiny. I'm personally not a fan of Chosen One narratives, but I was at least intrigued to see how, after setting her up to become a badass, Sapkowski would handle her time to shine. And then in the next book, Ciri briefly loses control of her powers, decides to never use them ever again, and then spends the rest of the series being tossed from one rapist to another. She falls in with some bandits, and then one of them tries to rape her before another bandit stops him so that she can rape Ciri for herself. Then she falls in with some dude in what is the most bizarre rape scene I have ever read. And then she gets captured by Leo Bonhart, a bounty hunter who doesn't physically rape her, but does everything he can to mentally and emotionally destroy her. And I clocked out before this, but according to Desmond Damon, after ditching Bonhart, Ciri falls in with some elves, and the Elf King repeatedly tries to rape her, but he can't get it up, because he finds humans to be so repulsive, and then he very possibly dies of a Viagra overdose, and at that point, I just... Let me repeat that. Ciri is set up as the Chosen One, who is going to do some great thing and save the world or something important. She trains under Geralt, Yennefer, and various other experts, learning combat and magic from the best. She then spends the rest of the series being raped and abused and broken. Is this meant as a subversion of Chosen One narratives? Because if so, it's a really juvenile one. Does Ciri get some great Chosen One moment at the end of the final book? Because if so, given the build-up payoff record of the novels, I don't think it would make up for all the rape and abuse she suffers. Is her final battle with Leo Bonhart supposed to be the culmination of her character arc and moment of triumph? Because if so, quite frankly, I find that deeply disappointing. I mean, yeah, it's nice that she gets to kill her abuser, but given how she forgives everyone else who raped her and reflects how they weren't even bad people, really, it seems kind of odd that Bonhart alone would be a target for her vengeance. My bigger issue with the idea, though, is that if the culmination of Ciri's character arc is her killing her abuser, then you are still centering her entire characterization around her abuse. And that is particularly infuriating when the stage was set for her to have a character arc completely unrelated to rape or abuse. From what I learned about Ciri's Chosen One status before I quit the series, it seems that her destiny was to be a magical broodmare to give birth to some Aryan superhuman. And according to Damon, the events of the novels are set into motion because of various parties who want to be the baby daddy to this Aryan superhuman trying to capture and rape Ciri for their own ends. One of these parties being her father! So, maybe Sapkowski never intended Ciri to do anything other than get raped, and I was Boo-Boo the Fool all along. If that's the case, though, then I'm glad I stopped reading when I did, especially given the final nail in the coffin of my enjoyment. That being, Dear Negative Reader. when I look back on my Witcher reading experience, I do sort of wonder why I stuck with the series for so long. I mean, the issues I had with the novels were there from the beginning. I just assumed that at some point the cynical charm and dark humor of the short stories would show up again, and the series would get back to the way that I liked it before. That didn't happen, of course, but none of these factors, the padding, the grimdark, not even the copious amounts of rape were enough to make me finally say fuck it and stop reading. No. What got me to stop reading was the beginning of the fifth and final novel, when we meet the titular Lady of the Lake, Nimue, and her apprentice Condwyrmers. They devote their entire lives to the study of the legends of Geralt and Ciri, because you see, their story is the greatest story in all of time and space. Their story is so amazing that there is an entire tower filled to the brim with paintings about their story, and there are people living in this tower who do nothing except use their magic powers to discover every minute detail of this story because it's just that amazing and perfect and genius. I am not shitting you. So suddenly, through the characters of Nimue and Condwyrmers, Sapkowski berates any would-be detractors to his narrative choices. So, not only do all the problems that plague the last 4 books continue, but now we have characters actually talking to the audience and shouting, well, if you don't like it, then maybe you just can't appreciate Sapkowski's genius.
He said the magic words, and I will never forget this, is ingrained in my mind. It was the nicest thing I ever heard. He said, if you don't like it, go home. I said, Ole, that's the best idea you've ever had.
That is when I stopped reading. Conclusion. I mentioned way back at the beginning that clips from The Witcher 3 kept popping up in my YouTube recommendations. Well, strange as it may sound, it was actually one of these clips that finally convinced me to take the plunge and start reading the Witcher books. It's this one.
Welcome back, child.
Siri! My, you've grown beautiful.
It is a moment of pure joy and love and happiness. I knew that The Witcher was going to be dark. I knew that it was going to be grim and violent and gritty before I ever set out to read it. But when I saw that moment of joy, I thought, okay, this is a series that understands how to balance darkness with hope. And the short stories largely live up to that. There aren't any moments of joy per se, but there are moments of satisfaction. When Geralt and his friends have lived through another day of adventure and they're all gazing out into the sunset like Ferris Bueller after his day off. But I do not remember a single moment of joy, or even of satisfaction from the novels. Not one. It's all just grimness and bleakness and nihilism, and I just couldn't get through that. I simply could not enjoy the novels like I did the short stories. And if any of the elements that were problems for me are problems for you, then I think it's best for you to avoid the novels as well. However, there's a saying used by Sapkowski when he was interviewed about the Netflix Witcher series. You cannot judge the soup by the groceries. And I think that's the perfect way to look at The Witcher. From day one, The Witcher stories were based on the idea of taking old recipes and adding a new grocery to it, and seeing what new soups could be made from the addition of a Witcher to our beloved childhood fables. And the thing about food and cooking is that not every recipe is a success, but something one person may not like, another person may like. And the beauty of The Witcher is that in such a remarkably short time, so many different soups have been made from its basic groceries. There are the short stories, the novels, the film, the TV shows, the video games, so many different things. And they are all unique and new spins on the characters and world. Maybe I couldn't get through the novels, but I really love the short stories, and I'm really curious to see what the games and movie and TV shows are like. And maybe you'll enjoy the novels when I couldn't. There are so many different Witcher stories out there, everyone is bound to find at least one that they love. So, if the Netflix show has you curious, then I highly recommend that you try at least one of these soups. For now, I'm Marco Keen, signing off, and I hope you liked this video. If you did and you'd like to see me make more, please leave a like or comment down below, share my video via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or other means, and subscribe to my channel. I would also like to thank an internet buddy of mine, Michal, whom I consulted on for this article. He has a blog, One Last Sketch, which you can check out in the link down below, so give him a look and give him some love and attention, eh? Thank you all, and I will see you in the next one.